And if you're staying in here, Luke chapter 24, that's where we'll read in just a moment, beginning in verse 13, if you want to mark your place there. All around the world today, people of faith are gathered in churches and in homes and in stadiums in some cases, singing, celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is something about the resurrection that gives us hope. There's something about this story, this moment in history, that sort of changes everything else, changes everything about everything. And it bears retelling again and again. And I'm sort of a sucker for a good story, and as anyone will tell you, the ending is what makes the story. And this is how Luke records it for us. After the women go to the tomb early on Easter morning, Luke writes this in verse 13, Luke chapter 24. He says, "Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, 'What are you discussing together as you walk along?' They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, 'Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened here in these days?' 'What things?' he asked. 'About Jesus of Nazareth,' they replied. 'He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us.'" That's a good line, isn't it? Some of our women amazed us. "They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us what they had seen, that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are. How slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Didn't the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going a little farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day's almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked to us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Sometimes just changing one thing about a story changes how you see everything else. That's what the resurrection was like. It's not that Jesus appears in a flash of light or in a blaze of glory or anything like that. He just walks right up beside these two disciples who are walking along the road. And they don't even recognize him, which means it's not until later that they realize exactly what had happened. It's not until the end of the day that they realize, wait, you mean we were with him the whole time? It's the kind of thing that makes you go back and reevaluate everything else that you had said and everything you'd seen and heard. You mean when we were explaining to him all that stuff about Jesus of Nazareth, it was him the whole time? Sometimes just changing one thing about a story changes how you see everything else. I kind of like mystery novels, and Agatha Christie was one of the great masters of crafting unbelievable endings in her mystery, crime, murder mystery novels. And in 2013, the British Crime Writers Association, I don't know who's in that association, British Crime Writers Association, they voted for the best murder mystery novel ever written. And the top award went to what many think is Agatha Christie's masterpiece, a book called The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And the reason why it got the top spot, of course, is because it has an unbelievable ending, which I'm going to spoil for you, but that's okay. I knew the ending when I read the book. It's still good. The trick is that the whole story is told from the perspective of this doctor, Dr. Shepard, who tells how the murder happens at Mr. Ackroyd's house. And he is one of the ones that examined the body and all that, There are many guests there for dinner, typical murder mystery setup. And the famous detective, Hercule Poirot, is called to the scene. And throughout the whole book, the doctor, Dr. Shepard, and the detective, Poirot, try to solve the murder of Mr. Ackroyd. And of course, you're trying to kind of figure out which character could have done this. Was it this person or that person the whole time? But at the very end of the book, what you discover is that the person narrating the story, the doctor who has been your only source of information thus far in the whole book, is actually the murderer. The murderer is the one writing the book, which makes you go back through every detail of the story and see it differently, because now you question whether the narrator was actually telling you the truth or not. It's the kind of ending where just changing one thing about the story makes you go back and re-examine the rest of the story, makes you go back and see everything else differently. Now, I don't know if you've considered this or not, but this is actually where our story begins. This is kind of what's at stake in the Gospel of Luke. After the cross, the disciples were questioning everything. All the things that Jesus had said, the death of Jesus made them go back through everything that they had been taught and told. Because how could this be the plan? How can someone who says, I am the bread of life, be killed? Can we still believe someone who said, I'm the light of the world, when it looks like darkness just snuffed out that light? So much of Jesus' teaching was just about himself, who he was. It didn't make sense after his death. These two on the road, they're confused, they're shaken, they're bewildered. They thought this was the end. And that's why, maybe why they're leaving town. We're told that one of them is named Cleopas. And we don't know anything about Cleopas except that he probably spent the rest of his life being teased about this story. Cleopas, how could you not know that it was Jesus? Come on, Cleo. Hey, Cleo, good to see you. Just to be clear, it's me, your friend John. Oh, you recognize me. Well, I just wanted to be sure about that. Didn't know, okay? We don't know who's with Cleopas. It's possible it's his wife. John tells us that one of the women who witnessed Jesus die was Mary, the wife of Clopas, which might be a different person or it might be a different spelling of the same name. But that's why in some artwork, in some places, if you see, like in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., there's a mosaic of this scene, and it shows Jesus with a couple, a man and a wife. So perhaps they're headed to their home in Emmaus, where they invite Jesus to stay with them. We can't be totally sure. All we're told is that they're trying to figure out everything about Jesus. They're talking, discussing everything that had happened. Jesus' death had made them go back and try and understand it all again. And as they are talking, Jesus walks up and says, what are you talking about? And they just stand still, and their faces are just downcast. They had put all their hope in Jesus. That's why they tell him, we had hoped he would be the one to redeem Israel. They had obviously been following Jesus, had believed what Jesus taught. They'd probably been there for the last week. They'd heard about Judas. They'd heard about Peter. They'd heard and maybe seen even Jesus crucified. And the story that they tell Jesus is a we had hoped story. Everyone has stories like this. Every human life is marked by we had hoped moments. Sometimes we never quite get over those moments. We had hoped it wouldn't be cancer. We had hoped to have a baby by now. I had hoped to become something. You might have said, I had hoped by this time in my life, ... I had hoped by this time in my life I wouldn't be struggling with the same things. I had hoped that things would get better. I had hoped we'd be married forever. I had hoped. for a job. I had hoped. Maybe you've learned not to hope, though. Maybe it's better not to hope sometimes. Because when you hope, this is what happens, isn't it? Hopes get dashed. You're just setting yourself up for disappointment when you hope. And maybe that's why they were leaving town. I don't know. I've never really been able to understand this. Cleopas and the unnamed disciple. Why were they leaving? The story was just getting good. From the way they tell the story, they say, some of those who were with us went to the tomb to see for themselves, which means that Cleo and his companion had been there with the other disciples and had stayed through Friday night and stayed through Saturday night, had grieved. And when everything is happening on Easter morning, the women go to the tomb and then some more. Peter goes to the tomb. Why didn't Cleo go check it out? Why not just go look? You're right there, just a quick run to see the empty tomb. But maybe afraid to hope. I mean, when your dreams are crushed, when your hopes are dashed, why set yourself up for that again? Why hope again? And what I love so much about this story is that of all people, Jesus decides to go and find two of the disciples who didn't even bother to check the tomb. He walks with them, and he knows they're confused, and he talks to them about it. And in the midst of them saying, where in the world is God in this mess? The punchline of the story is that God is right there. Jesus has been with them the whole time. Because this isn't a story about humanity looking for God. They go looking to the women who go to the tomb, they're looking for Jesus. But this isn't a story about humanity looking for God. The promise of Easter is that the risen Jesus has come to us. He finds us. He meets us where we are, right in the midst of everyday life, on a journey, or in the midst of disappointment or despair. And sometimes you won't know that he's present. You won't recognize him. But one of the reasons I think Luke wanted to record this story for us is because sometimes changing one thing about a story changes how you see everything else. After the cross, the hopes are dashed, they doubt everything. But if Jesus is alive, if the resurrection is real, then wait, that means that the whole time, even at the cross, God's been there. God was there the whole time, even when I didn't recognize it. Even the cross was part of the plan, even when I couldn't see it, even when my hopes were dashed. Through all of that, God was still present. God was still working, and Jesus was walking with me. Why hope again? Because hope in a resurrected Lord will never be disappointed. Your hope in a risen Savior will never be misplaced. Your hope in Jesus Christ will never come to nothing. But Collin, you might say, they hoped in Jesus. And weren't they disappointed? I mean, they had their hopes in Jesus, weren't they? Weren't those hopes dashed? And this is really important. Did you notice that Jesus rebukes them? He tells them they're foolish and slow of heart to believe, but he's not rebuking them for being disappointed. He's rebuking them for hoping in the wrong thing. They had hoped that Jesus would fix their problems with the Romans. They had hoped that Jesus would make Israel into a powerful nation again. They had hoped that Jesus would drive out their enemies. They wanted a Messiah who was victorious, not a Messiah who would suffer. And that was foolish. It was foolish to hope for a Messiah who wouldn't suffer. You know why? Jesus tells them why. Jesus takes them back. The resurrection means you have to go back through the old stories and see them in a new light. Jesus takes them back through the Old Testament to see what stories, all the things that had pointed to him. And we don't know exactly what Jesus says, but the Old Testament had always pointed to one who would have to suffer. From the very beginning, if you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, the story's about a serpent who deceives Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are just told to expect death when they disobey God. But they don't die. At least not right away. They expect death, but instead they get life. And God says something to them that's unbelievable when you consider it was written over 1,000 years before Jesus was born. More than that. God gives a promise. He says something to the serpent in the garden. He says, someone is coming to deal with you, serpent. An offspring of the woman, a human, is coming. He will strike your head, serpent, and you will strike his heel. That's a death blow both ways, by the way. Striking the serpent's head would kill it. But if a poisonous serpent strikes your heel, you die. That's the point. Whoever comes to deal with the serpent would, in the process, have to die. But for now, Adam and Eve expect death, but they get life. It's the same with the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham almost sacrificed his beloved son, Isaac. But at the last minute, instead of sacrificing Isaac, the Lord provided a different sacrifice, a ram. So instead of death, life. It's the same with the story of Joseph. His brothers throw him in a pit. They decide to kill him. But instead of death, he lives. He ends up in another pit in Egypt. But then he's brought up out of the pit. And his brothers come to him during the famine. And when they find out it's the brother they almost killed, they expect death. But instead, they get life. It's the same with the Exodus from Egypt. When God was going to rescue, to redeem his people from Egypt, he sends death, the death of the firstborn, through the land, except for those with the blood of a slaughtered lamb on the doorpost. And instead of death, they would get life. It's like all these stories. We expect the end to be death, but then something happens, and we get life. What if all these stories are leading somewhere, pointing to something? Some of you may have heard this story several years ago. It's about 8 years ago now, I think. And it's about a soccer team in Thailand, young people, teenagers, soccer team that was trapped in some caves there in Thailand. You remember that story? I don't know if you heard of it. They went exploring this cave system, and it was after a soccer practice, they were all together, and they were inside the cave, and it started to rain. And I mean, it rained all the rain all at once. And it inside these caves, trapped the soccer team, 12 teenage boys and their assistant coach. I think he was in his 20s. And they're 2.5 miles from the entrance of the cave. That's a long way. It's just tunnels that are underwater with the murkiest, muddiest water that you can imagine. There's no possible way that they could save themselves. It was either rescue or death. And the rescue operation was basically an impossible feat. I mean, even if the cave divers could reach them 2.5 miles from the entrance, there was no way to train all 12 boys on how to make a 3-hour journey through underwater tunnels with cave diving gear. I mean, if they got claustrophobic, if they panicked, they would drown. The only way to do it, they decided, was to sedate the boys, literally put them to sleep and drag them out one by one, unconscious. Each journey would take 3 hours, but because the anesthesia would wear off after about 45 minutes, the cave divers would have to re-administer the drugs along the way. And this is assuming that none of the boys' masks would get knocked off. You know, they're bumping into the cave walls while being dragged out. I mean, it seemed impossible. But in the end, every single one of them was rescued alive. And when the last one comes out, you can watch the film and you can feel the relief spread over everyone. And the heaviness lifts, and there's a collective sigh and tears of just sheer relief. And one of the parents comes to the divers and says, "It's like our children have died and been given another life." That's the story. We expected death, but instead, we were given life. Life instead of death, but only because of a rescue. The rescuer had to go all the way into the cave. There's no other way. It's not just a lifeline. The only way was to enter the cave. That's the twist in the story of Scripture. That the only way for humanity to get life and not death is for someone to go into the cave of death to rescue us. Adam and Eve only get life because someone else will do battle with the serpent and suffer death on their behalf. Isaac is only spared because there's a ram provided as a substitute. Something else has to die. And the people of Israel are spared the death in Egypt because the lamb would die instead of their firstborns. The chosen family of God would not die in famine because Joseph would save them. Joseph, who had gone down into the pit, even though he was innocent. And when he comes up out of the pit and is vindicated, he's able to save them from death. Story after story doesn't just point to a rescue, but to the fact that the rescuer would need to suffer death in order to rescue us. It's as though God designed all the plot twists of the Old Testament stories in such a way that when Jesus came and lived and died, his story would be the missing piece of the puzzle. Jesus' death had been part of the story all along, and this is why it's so foolish to hope for a Messiah who would never suffer. We have hopes. We have hopes for circumstances. We have hopes for situations. We have hopes for all sorts of things that we want. But what good are those hopes when you're in a cave? There is nothing else worth hoping for unless you get out of the cave. Nothing else is going to last. Are you going to hope for something when you're in the dark of the cave that's not rescue? No, nothing else will mean anything unless you're rescued from the cave. Every other hope might be dashed, but the one hope you cling to is rescue. And to ask for a Messiah who doesn't suffer means you get a Messiah who can't rescue you from the thing that you need rescuing from most, which is death, sin, suffering. Make no mistake, the vision at the end of the story is nothing less than every single tear being wiped from every single eye. That's what we're told in Revelation, that God will wipe every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more, and mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the former things have passed away. That's the end. That's where the story is headed. That's reason enough, I think, to put your hope in the Messiah, but that's not the only reason to put your hope in a suffering Messiah. It's not just that we're rescued through his suffering. It's also that our suffering is changed. When he shares in our death, we share in the hope of his resurrection. The resurrection sort of works backwards and turns defeat into a story of unexpected victory. Just like the rescue from the cave changes how you see the captivity, because the result works backwards and turns the story into one that is about courage and compassion and joy. It's like a basketball game. You watch the Final Four, it's like a basketball game where your team is losing the whole game. And every missed shot, every setback is a blow. All the turnovers, I can't believe it. You're yelling at the TV. But then at the very last second, at the buzzer, the final shot goes in, and all of a sudden, you say, that was the best game I've ever seen. But no, actually, it wasn't. They were behind the whole time. It was full of missed shots and turnovers. But the win works backwards, so that all of those things become part of what brings you joy in the end. The hope that we have through the resurrection of Christ is that he can bring life from death, redemption from pain, victory in the midst of weakness and defeat. So the journey that led through suffering and pain, when you look back, you'll see. That's the journey Jesus came to share with me. His grace met me there. He was with you on the road. So that the story in the end won't be about the circumstances you face or the problems or all of that. It will be a story about Jesus in the end. Our captivity, when we receive the rescue Jesus offers, becomes a story of love and deliverance and joy and redemption. And all of the ups and downs will contribute to the joy of seeing how his love sustained you, his compassion comforted you, how his resurrection gave you hope that in the end, at the end of all of it, there's life, not death. And this week I was reading through the end of the book of Luke here, walked to Emmaus. I kept wondering, why didn't they recognize Jesus? What was it? I mean, I read some different scholars, commentators. There were a lot of guesses. Was Jesus' appearance different? Did he look different? Did he look younger? Did his hair change? Was the sun in their eyes? That's literally one of the commentators I read. And the truth is, they're all just speculating because Luke doesn't tell us why they didn't recognize Jesus. And that's because, I think, Luke isn't interested in explaining why. He only gives us information, enough information to determine what wasn't the reason why. We know what wasn't the reason. We don't know the reason they didn't recognize him. We just don't know, we know what wasn't the reason. The reason they couldn't recognize Jesus wasn't because Jesus wasn't there. That's not why they didn't recognize him. It's not because Jesus wasn't there. I don't know where your hopes have been dashed. I don't know where your story is most broken. And I can't tell you why those things happened, but I can tell you what was not the reason. It wasn't because God wasn't there. You cannot look back over your story and say, I know why God felt distant. I know why this thing happened. It's because God abandoned me. No. It's not because God was not there. In the person of Jesus Christ, God came to be with us. And what we will find at the end of all things is that when we look back, Jesus was with us the whole time. Even though often we didn't recognize him. Can you imagine walking on that road and thinking they were just heading home or going for a walk, but really they were in a story about Jesus? And so are we, and so are you, and so am I, just as surely as they were. Sometimes just changing one thing about a story makes you see everything else differently. And there are stories all over this room that go like this. I was just living my life in the midst of pain or illness or chaos or, in the midst of searching everywhere for love and acceptance, or in the midst of mundane, day-to-day, dirty dishes, bills, work. And I realized that the whole time I've been in a story about Jesus. My past, however rocky, is what led me to him. Everything before was leading to a point. It was a story about rescue. It's a story about Jesus. And then the rest of my life after that was just the unfolding or the outworking of when I put my hope and trust in him. And it changed how I saw everything else. Billions of people throughout history have said, were not our hearts burning within us? Not because they were on the road that day, but because you don't have to be on the road to have Scripture open for you and to hear the story in a way that brings you face to face with the risen Jesus. And you have to decide, will you put your hope in him or not? There is no doubt that every one of us is in a story where we expect death. There is no hope of avoiding or escaping death. Your only hope, my only hope, is to hope in the one who conquered death. And for those who follow Jesus, death is not the end of their story any more than it was the end of his story. And there may be several kinds of people here today. Some who surrendered their life to Jesus, to following the risen Lord. And you may need reminding this morning that your hope is in him. That in grief or loss or pain, whatever it is, he is walking with you. Or perhaps you need reminding that the whole time when you're, caring for kids or going about your job or living your everyday life, you're in a story about Jesus. And he's waiting for you to recognize his presence with you. You might be here this morning, and if you had to characterize where you were with God this morning, you would probably say distant. Or you might even say, I really don't know. I don't know where I'm at with God. That's not been on my radar. That's not something I think about. Can I just ask, can I just push, challenge maybe a little bit this morning that you would take one step in the direction of faith? One step. Just one. It might be a step to re-engage in church. I don't know. It might be a step to be honest with God where you're at. Might be a step maybe just to pray for the first time in a long time. You might be skeptical. You might say, I need to see more evidence that Jesus is alive. I need to examine the faith before I decide. That's fine. Take one step today. Come have a conversation with me after the service. Come ask a question. Engage in finding out for yourself. Come back next week. Just see for yourself, but take one step. For some of you, maybe you've been without hope for long enough, and you'd say, I know what it's like to have hope stashed. And I'm ready. I need hope. And maybe the step that I need to take today is to trust Jesus and take my first step in following him for the rest of my life. Could it be that your heart is burning within you because life has taught you to expect death, but instead, unexpectedly today, you feel yourself turning to Christ for new life? What is that? That's the Holy Spirit. Take a step towards faith today. Every week we just close our service with a song, and during the song we ask people to respond to the Lord. We'll have some people at the front to pray with anyone who would like someone to pray with. We want to walk with you. So if you need to take a step toward Jesus this morning, let us walk that journey with you. And as we sing, you come. And let's begin our time of response with a prayer. Would you pray with me?